Good evening and welcome to the second in our Tea Talk series, Eleanor William Hooker Tea Talk series, Writing While Black, the Afrofuturistic writer. We're really excited to have our guests with us today, and our moderator, Dennis Britton, will tell you a little bit more about them. The Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire promotes awareness and appreciation of African American history and life in order to build more inclusive communities today. This is the second Talking Our series. And last week we looked at farming. Our series is Claiming Our Place, Blacks in White Spaces. And we define white spaces as spaces where Blacks and people of color are marginalized, typically absent or unexpected. Last week, we looked at the landscape, farming, and today's talk will explore Black writers and characters in a genre where they have not been expected to excel, science fiction. Our tea talks are really based on the African tradition of really coming together to share stories and dialogue around a cup of tea. Usually we meet in person, but we're now in the Zoom world because of this pandemic, and we will work to make this dialogue as engaging as we possibly can. And we want people to really engage, to share stories. We'll listen to the stories our presenters have to share with us, and hopefully we will have a really engaging dialogue. Before we get started, I'll pass you over to Gina, who will give you just a little technical housekeeping before we get started. Gina?
Oh, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, give me just a moment here. I just have a couple of housekeeping things real quick. We ask that everyone keep their mics muted, please, during the presentation. If you have any questions during the presentations, please put them in the chat. Our moderator, Dennis Britton, will be keeping an eye on the chat for any questions for our presenters. After the presentations, when we switch to the Q&A portion of the program, if you could use the raise the hand option in the chat, we'll use that for the Q&A portion. Dennis will see that you have the hand raised and will call on you. You can then unmute your mic and ask your question to the presenters. And we also have put up on the screen our community dialogue group agreement. We ask that everyone please be respectful and listen and share the airtime. Focus on the idea and not the person. Please be present. Please be crisp and say what is to the core of the conversation. Please be open-minded. Please honor confidentiality within the group. It's okay to put issues like race and class on the table in this discussion. And please take risks. Be raggedy, make some mistakes, and then let it go. That is what I have to say. Thank you. Back to Jerry Ann.
Thank you so much, Gina. Well, for our program today, we're really excited to have our Dennis Britton, who is an associate professor of English at the University of New Hampshire. His research interest includes early modern English literature, especially literature of William Shakespeare and Edmund Spenser. He does protest theology, critical race theory, and the history of emotions. We're also excited to announce he's our new president of the Black Heritage Trail that started in this year. So without much ado, I'll pass you over to President Dennis Britton.
President Dennis Britton, I like the sound of that. All right. Thank you so much, Jerry Ann, and thank you, Gina. And thank you all for being with us today for this discussion, Writing While Black, the Afrofuturistic Writer. So I grew up watching Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica with my father. I'm sure other shows were watched in my house, but these two shows and the Jeffersons are the ones that I most associate with my early childhood. For whatever reason, you know, those three shows are like imprinted on me in some interesting ways. The worlds of these shows are of course very different. The Jeffersons takes place in the then present and in a deluxe apartment in the sky. Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica take place in the future, but one in which Black people were noticeably absent. Where did all the Black people go? Are there no Black people in the future? I wonder if Lieutenant Uhura often got lonely, or maybe just sick of being the only Black person on that ship. Despite the historical lack of representation in the genre of science fiction, our panelists today are indeed taking up necessary and important space in what is seen as an all-white landscape. In recent years, there has been an uptick, if not an actual surge of works by science fiction writers of color, and a greater recognition of science fiction writers of color who have been writing all along. For writers of color, the distinction between science fiction and fantasy is often a blurred one, and that is a question we might return to later on today. Is there a difference between science fiction and fantasy? Does that distinction matter? We might also ask and think about, how do Black writers in particular deal with science? And I'll put science, a sort of capital S science in quotation marks, especially as access to scientific knowledge from which science fiction is often linked, though in an imaginative way. How's the ways in which scientific knowledge has been used to exploit people from African descent, as well as been denied, as well as folks of African descent being denied access to science. And the classification of what is and is not science, of course, has a racist history. Whose facts get to be science, whose facts get to be folklore or home remedies or pseudoscience. And of course, we also do know the ways in which the supposed inferiority of Black people was understood once upon a time to be a scientific fact. Science, therefore, has done Black people dirty, and that science has often been used to legitimize anti-Black racism, right? And science, for a lot of Black folks, is a fiction. There is therefore a very complex relationship between race, science, and fiction that is well worth interrogating. And again, our panelists today are making very important room for themselves and others in this literary space we call science fiction, and maybe more particularly as Afrofuturistic writers, which a definition we might return to or ask them to think about, or ask you what you think that means later on today. So I'm very, very excited to introduce our panelists today. Our panelists are Sheree Renee Thompson, who is an award-winning fiction writer, poet, and editor. Her work is inspired by myth and folklore, natural science, and the genius of the Mississippi Delta. 9 Bar Blues, Stories from an Ancient Future, is published in 2020, and is her debut fiction collection. She is also the author of the hybrid collection, Sleeping Under the Tree from 2016, which was longlisted for the 2016 Otherwise Award and honored with a PW Star review and Shotgun Lullabies. She edited the 2-time World Fantasy Award winning groundbreaking anthologies Dark Matter in 2020 and 2024. I'm sorry, 2020, I'm getting in the future myself. 2020, no, sorry, 2000. I'm in the future. Let me get back to the present. This was in 2000 and in 2004, and is the first to introduce W.E.B. Du Bois's science fiction short stories. Her work is widely anthologized and appears in Marvel's Black Panther, Tales of Wakanda, edited by Jesse J. Holland, The New York Times, and The Big Book of Modern Fantasy, edited by Anne and Jeff Vandermeer from 2020. She was honored as a 2020 World Fantasy Award finalist in the Special Award Professional category for contribution to the genre, and is the editor of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, founded in 1949, as well as she is the associate editor of Obsidian, Literature and Arts in the African Diaspora, founded in 1975. She has also reviewed new books for Asimov. She's a special guest and co-host of with Malka Order of the 2021 Hugo Awards ceremony in Washington, D.C. Sheree lives in Memphis, Tennessee, near the mighty river of a pyramid. We also have with us today Nisi Shawl, who is an African-American author, editor, and educator, best known for their work dealing with gender, race, and colonialism, such as the 2016 Nebula finalist Everfair, and the classic text on inclusivity in the imaginative genres, Writing the Other, A Practical Approach. In 2019, they received the Kate Willems Solstice Award for distinguished service to the genre. Shawl's story collection, Filter House, is a winner of the Tiptree Otherwise Award. Additional publications include the collections Something More and More, a primer on Nisi Shawl, and Talk Like a Man, part of PM Press's Outspoken Authors series. Additional honors include the World Fantasy Award, Starbus Magazine's Brave New Worlds Award, Faya Magazine's Ignite Award, and 2 Lucas Awards. They edited the acclaimed anthology New Sons, original speculative fiction by people of color, and WisCon Chronicles 5, Writing and Racial Identity. Their co-edited Strange Matings, Science Fiction, Feminism, African-American Voices, and Octavia Butler, and Stories from Chip, a tribute to Samuel R. Delaney. Shawl has spoken at Duke, Spelman, Princeton, University of Hawaii, among many other institutions, and they live in Seattle, where they take frequent walks with their cat. And we also have with us Dr. Reynaldo Anderson, who currently serves as Associate Professor of Communication Studies at Harris-Stowe State University in St. Louis, Missouri. Reynaldo is currently the Executive Director and co-founder of the Black Speculative Arts Movement, an international network of artists, intellectuals, creatives, and activists. He is the co-editor of the following anthologies and journals: Afrofuturism 2.0, The Rise of Astro-Blackness and the Black Speculative Arts Movement, Black Futurity, Art plus Design, Cosmic Underworld, a grimoire of Black speculative discontents, Black Lives, Black Politics, Black Futures, a special issue of Topia, Canadian Journal of Cultural Studies, and When is Wakanda? Afrofuturism and Dark Speculative Futurity. He is also the author of numerous articles on Africana studies and communication studies, and helped conceive the joint BSAM and New York Live Arts curating the End of the World online exhibition. So we have a very, 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 as you can see, esteemed set of panelists, and I'm very excited to see what we have to learn from them today. So can I now have, I think, are all our panelists showing their faces? Are we all here? All right, Sheree with us?
Yes, hello.
All right, we'll begin with you. Excellent.
All right, hello. I don't see my other guest.
They're here, I know they're here. I've seen them. They're here somewhere.
Hi, I'm Sheree Renee Thomas, Very good to see you all. Greeting you from Memphis, Tennessee. Hope that you are well. I was hoping that someone else would go first because I've been talking about basic Afrofuturism for 25 years. So I wanted to introduce a different conversation about Afrofuturists that I think you might enjoy. I wanted to talk about the women of Afrofuturists in preparation for Women's History Month, and because one of my panelists, Nisi Shawl, is here. And I think it's important to celebrate the kind of work that Nisi, that they've been doing for many years. So my talk, just a brief talk, is Dangerous Muses. Dangerous Muses. You know, there are 9 muses in Greek mythology, and they represent the different areas of the arts, right? And the area that we're going to talk about today, of course, is storytelling, the writing part of it. But I have found something that I've just been thinking about since I edited the first collection of Black speculative art or Black speculative fiction, Dark Matter, in 2000, Dark Matter, a century of speculative fiction from the African diaspora, which came out from Warner Books. Since that time, and I'm looking at where we are now in the 21st century, I found that it is the women voices that have been the most powerful and the most world-changing, I think. And some of the work that I've been reading over these many years has just been amazing. And I think that they're doing other things outside of the page as well that is important to talk about too. Where there is a woman, there is magic. Ntozake Shange proclaim it. And these writers that I'm going to talk about today represent that magic. Black women writers, Black writers are no exception to that. If Samuel R. Delaney ushered in a new pioneering path for Black voices and Black genius in the field of science fiction in the 1960s, and Octavia E. Butler, a former student of his and a peer, as well, helped to widen and expand that grand path, then these magical Black women writers are carving a path so strong, so bold, and so beautiful that it is their voices and their visions that are shaping Afrofuturism and African futurism, and any other words you want to apply to this work today. The subgenre's controversial and complicated journey into the stars would be stunted, and I would say it would be earthbound without their unique contributions. Black women speculative fiction writers are dangerous muses, women whose work is inspiring a new renaissance, a re-emergence of Afrofuturism, Black speculative art in its many forms. They use and retool genre conventions to revise and reverse long-held meanings that define our community and communal storytelling. They defy old meanings imposed on Black women's bodies and amplify their voices, creating characters that become the heroines of their own adventures, the creators of their own unforgettable tales. Their choice of characterization, language, themes, structure of the storytelling, and the setting do not reinforce traditional notions of whose stories are worth telling. All of their stories are universal. All of them, to me, are part of the canon that we are beginning to talk about more in more detail these days of Afrofuturism. Nor do their stories, how they tell their stories, reinscribe the old ways of storytelling in literature. So I always ask my scholars and educators to please keep up with the rapid fire amount of work that's being published today. If you are only citing our wonderful pioneers, contemporary pioneers, Samuel Delaney and Octavia Butler, you are behind, not only as a scholar, because I think you're supposed to keep up with things at least within the past 5 years, right, of your field, but you are doing yourself a big disservice and your readers, your students, your audience, because even in the past 2 years alone, there are so many writers that a person who studies this work every single day, this is what I do. It's not something I'm just coming new to or dipping into and discovering. It is what I've done. It's not a label that I've just, added to myself because it's now in the mainstream. It is what I naturally would call myself, right? An Afrofuturist. I'm comfortable with that term, Black speculative artist, what have you, science fiction writer, fantasy. I cannot keep up with all of these books that are coming out. And I review books, which was my early roots. I reviewed the Parable of the Talent for Washington Post, which was Octavia E. Butler's second book in the series. So if I, a person who studies this every day, am, trying to keep up with all of the work, then I know that scholars who are their wonderful, important work that they do, which is, helping to place this work in context for us and helping to shape the craft of new scholars for the next generation. I'm going to need you to keep up as well, even more so. So who are these amazing, wonderful writers whose work is dangerous to the status quo of mainstream publishing, whose work is destroying old temples of golden ages past and are stealthily building the world anew in their own remarkable images to create a new future for us all? These writers include my panelists, Nisi, Shawl. I would also include Jennifer Marie Brissett, whose novel Elysium and her new work is definitely classic science fiction. The writer who has multiple genres she writes in, Tanana Rivdu, who is mostly known for horror, but is a great science fiction writer as well, and a fantasy writer too, and is doing things not only just on the page and in the classroom as a teacher herself, but also on the screen. She has written with her writing partner and life partner husband, Stephen Barnes, another fellow Afrofuturist. They've written for Twilight Zone, the new series that Jordan Peele has reintroduced to the world. So, and they have other exciting projects on the way. So that is another one of our dangerous muses. Jewel Gomez, who has been publishing long before we were having these conversations about this genre, with her Gilda stories and her other works and her plays. I believe the Gilda Stories was celebrated by the Feminist Press because it had I think the 25th anniversary of the work. And of course, it was adapted as a musical performance by the Urban Bush Women. So that's Jewel Gomez, amazing writer and queer writer who places all of those identities in her work very consciously, which is important. Andrea Hairston, a writer whose new novel, Master of Poisons, is, I believe, on the Nebula recommended reading list right now. And is had all of her books are going to be reissued so that you can enjoy the wide, diverse types of works. You can't put Andrea in a single genre no more than you can most of these writers that I'm going to talk about today. Nalo Hopkinson, who has a Caribbean, Canadian heritage and places all of that history in a lot of her writing, just recently named a Grand Master of Science Fiction, right? N.K. Jemisin, Nora Jemisin, what can we say? Creating history every single time she puts words on the page, opening up so many doors for all of us as writers. Just won a MacArthur Genius Award. I know they don't like to include the genius in it, but we like to say it because these writers and artists are in fact geniuses. And the only other person in science fiction who can claim that honor is Octavia E. Butler. Karen Lord, Sophia Somatar, Rivers Solomon, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, Kiini Ibura Salam, Evie Zaboy, who works mostly in young adult literature, National Book Award finalist, former student of mine as well. These women are helping to frame Black women's agency and aesthetics in a world that often denies the existence of both. As a speculative fiction writer and an editor myself, I've witnessed the extraordinary shifts in the field with excitement and with hope. As sisters, we Black women writers map the future. We are innovators in the field of world breaking and world making by exploring the relationship between indigenous and folk traditional culture with its healing and root work and sophisticated, modified adaptations of applications of technology. Of course, our Black bodies being used as technology against our will, being used as the tool of capitalism to help make America the global titan that it has become in the world. These things are very much a part of our aesthetic and the way that we think about our stories and the way that we think about how we choose to tell those stories. The work also represents an evolution of social and political issues that have haunted the African diaspora over time, over centuries. Black women writers are taking the lead in that movement of creating works that evoke the past, works that critique the present, because that's what most speculative fiction does. They ask you, maybe even whether we're writing in 100 years in the future on another planet that doesn't exist, in an alternate world, we are creating commentary on the world that we live in today. This work challenges us to imagine a greater, more possible vision or visions that are shaping Afrofuturism today. I like to think that this is a open source code that people around the world are beginning to adapt and create and reimagine for their own purposes wherever they are. When I first joined the Afrofuturism conversation in the 1990s, being a moderator for Alondra Nelson's Afrofuturism.net listserv. Of course, you know, Alondra Nelson, the scholar, is now the first Afrofuturist in the White House, being a part of President Biden's science team now. And that's amazing accomplishment, which is why I think of all of these people as dangerous muses, because we're going to change things for the better. But this work, that these writers are creating can be controversial at times, but it represents a complicated journey that we've had on this earth and into the stars of our imagination. And I think that the genre itself would be stunted and completely a very different thing without their unique contributions. So thank you so much. And I look forward to hearing what Nisi Shawl and Dr. Reynaldo Anderson and our audience has to say about this exciting work that is new to you, but about 160 years old in America in English as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheree. That was fantastic. And we will now turn it over to our next presenter, Nisi.
All right. Cool. Well, I want to say first, thank you. Thank you to the organizers of the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire Tea Talks for inviting Sheree, Reynaldo, and me to be on this panel and for doing so much to make this moment possible. Thank you to everyone joining us here for these events. For you, Sheree, and Reynaldo, and you, Dennis, thank you. The audience, the staff, the volunteers, you all contribute greatly to this experience. I want to share with you some of how I have come to be an Afrofuturist writing while Black, and how I've come to find other Afrofuturists writing while Black, and how that's looked in the past, and how I expect to look at it in the future. I want to do all that in 10 to 15 minutes. Well, maybe some things will fall by the wayside. If you've had a chance to read through my short article, Crash Course in the History of Black Science Fiction, which our hosts kindly linked to from the series recommended reading page, you know that I know that Afrofuturism has existed as a genre for hundreds of years. It existed way, way before Mark Derry coined it as a term he used in his 1994 essay on Samuel R. Delaney, Greg Tate, and Tricia Rose. But I'd rather leave any deeper analysis of the Afrofuturist phenomenon to scholars like Dennis and Reynaldo. I'm more comfortable talking about this topic on a personal, anecdotal level. So I've always wanted to be an author, if by author you mean magician. As a 5-year-old, that was my answer when adults asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. I wanted to be a real magician. I sometimes had to explain that, a real magician, not the kind of faker pulling rabbits out of top hats. As a writer, I perform real magic. How? By insinuating my worlds inside your mind with words. That's the most powerful magic of all. If I can change what you think and feel, get you to perceive what I'm telling you, get you to want my stories to be real, I win. I'm a magician. If I had possessed the understanding and vocabulary to spell out these particulars when I was a child, I doubt very much the adults quizzing me would have thought any better of my chances of being a professional author than of riding a broom or bringing enchanted statues to life. Because this was the late 1950s and early 1960s. And while we had Richard Wright and James Baldwin and Ralph Ellison and Langston Hughes and Lorraine Hansberry, guess how many that was compared to the huge numbers of white writers? It was a smattering. And guess how many of these well-known Negro, the word we used then, authors were women? One. And guess how many were writing science fiction or fantasy or horror or anything remotely resembling the imaginative genres? Basically none. None were claimed. None remembered. There were none on the horizon. The field of imagination lay fallow. So when, a decade later, I went to model myself on other speculative fiction writers, I chose feminist templates. Those were what was available. Susie McKee Charnas, Joanna Russ, Monique Wittig, and Octavia Butler. Yeah, that's how I found Octavia, not because I looked for other Black women who wrote the kind of thing I needed to write, but because I looked for other feminists who did. When I recount my literary journey to people, they're surprised I didn't turn to the example of Samuel R. Delaney. These days, I don't go 1 week without praising Delaney's techniques, his criticism, his audacity, insight, persistence, and 1,000 other qualities to be found in his writing. Back then, though, I hadn't read Derry or any other theorist, and Black to the Future, the essay that gave the movement its name, hadn't been written yet. Plus, I didn't know Delaney was Black. Shocking, isn't it? I didn't really find out for sure until I read his essay in the anthology Sheree edited, Dark Matter. No, I didn't know, but I knew I was Black. So I wrote from my personal experience, my lived life. This entailed some serious, studious reflection, some theorizing of my own. Attending the Clarion West Writers Workshop in 1992, I was instructed to write about an ordinary person discovering something, anything, marvelous on the beach. Ruminating on the assignment, I came to the abrupt realization that I was the marvel. Instead of exploring the incident from the expected viewpoint, I wrote it from that of a wounded mermaid that a normal human stumbles upon. I made the object the subject, made the passive active, made the phenomenon the agent. I took the identity of the other as my own and moved it from the narrative's margins to its center. Some of what I write fits Derry's rather restrictive definition of Afrofuturism in the way that my writing relates to technology. Again, going back to the Dark Matter anthologies, my story Maggie's is Afrofuturist. There are stories online in my Making Amends stories series. One of them is The Mighty Finn, P-H-I-N. That's sort of like cyberpunk Afrofuturist. So there's that. And then there's some of my work which blurs or outright ignores the distinction between science and magic. Phenomenon which Dennis mentioned in his introduction, and a characteristic which I've come to believe is one of the hallmarks of Afrofuturism in its broader and, to my mind, more practical sense. I have called my steampunk novel Everfair an alternate history of the Belgian Congo. I've called that Afro-retrofuturism, which is a mashup of Afrofuturism with another name for steampunk, retrofuturism. Afro-retrofuturism. Publisher and author Milton Davis calls Everfair steam funk. I've also written a fair amount of what John Jennings calls the ethnogothic literature, which is more closely related to horror as a genre than to fantasy or science fiction. In one explanation of the term, Jennings evokes Erykah Badu's Bag Lady, Here it go. Bag lady, you gon' hurt your back, dragging all them bags like that. I guess nobody ever told you all you must hold on to is you, is you, is you. According to Jennings, experiencing the ethnogothic is a way to get rid of all those bags, get rid of that luggage that we need to drop to move into the Afrofuture. It's about letting go of the pain and terror we're better off without. So in my story of a young Black woman's battles against a mind-controlling fungus, I deliberately invoke images of lynchings, invoke and release, invoke and release. That's what the ethnogothic does, invoke and release. For me, Afrofuturism is less about time, the future, and more about hope. Remember the future, we hippies used to say. That's what I do. I remember the future, and that's what I write. That's what I write. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nisi, for those personal reflections. And now we have our final presenter, Reynaldo. There he is. All right.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the Tea Talks and Dennis and the rest of the staff for inviting me to this talk today. I was thinking about why Sheree and Nisi were talking. How I get to science fiction and speculative tradition is I'm fourth generation military. And a lot of times people don't realize in the military, you get exposed to advanced technology before the civilians get exposed to it. And so my route into the science fiction speculative tradition comes through a cross-fertilization of studying Black history, dealing with technology on the USS Blue Ridge, which was the flagship of the 7th Fleet during the Cold War. I believe it still is the flagship. And as a member, and I was a member of a Marine detachment during that time. And so my earliest science fiction books that I remember enjoying were Heinlein's book, Starship Troopers. I remember reading, but even though I'm more of a fantasy kind of person, more than science fiction in terms of what I like. And I remember a person who was a mentor of mine told me there are basically 5 types of people who run the world: businessmen, military people, politicians, and gangsters. And so I always looked at science fiction and speculated what are some of its practical uses, and what does this look like when a social scientist, as I've been trained, interacts with it. And so I kind of come at this through the social scientist tradition. And if Dan can put up my first slide there, so I can kind of walk you through some of the authors. That piece of art there, that was a product of something myself and John Jennings came up with. I sent him a prototype of what I thought, looking back forward and into the past with the double-headed figure, that kind of Janus face look in terms of past and future in relation to technology and culture. And we conceived of that in 2015, and it later becomes the covers for a couple of books. But moving along to the next slide, when we talk about this idea of science fiction versus Black speculative tradition, Asimov has defined science fiction as how people react to technology and society. Heinlein talks about it in relation to other futures. Science fiction in the 19th century, and when it emerges, really didn't have anything to do with Black people in terms of, well, I guess whether you want to draw on Marie Shelley's Frankenstein and other people that are putting work out. The Black speculative tradition is a separate tradition that emerges along the same time that modern science fiction emerges, but they had 2 separate missions. Science fiction was more of the European reaction to the Industrial Revolution, modern science, and I guess with and some of the philosophies related to Nietzsche and other thinkers of the time. Martin Delaney puts this story together. He's also known as like the father of Black nationalism, the military man, and he's also a scientist. He was trained to be a physician. And he puts this book out in two parts, first called The Blake or the Huts of America before the Civil War, talking about the need for Black Americans or Blacks in the diaspora to get their own nation state in terms of being able to secure their liberty. One of the things following Delaney, they probably are articulating in this fashion because the stories about Henry Blake, a man who escaped slavery and gets free Blacks and slaves together to engage in this revolution. Because in the 19th century, before the Civil War, for an enslaved African to imagine freedom was science fiction. So that's when we talk about the Black speculative tradition. It has always been a critique on the contradiction of what they would call the Western Enlightenment. On the one hand, that appeals to these higher order thinking and philosophical ideas, yet is contradicted by the way it treats enslaved Africans and indigenous people. And so what Black speculative fiction does, it heightens those contradictions, consistently pointing out those contradictions between what people say and write and then what they actually do. If you can move to the next slide, please. H.G. Wells and Du Bois are two key figures when you're talking about social science and the Black speculative tradition. H.G. Wells was not only a science fiction writer, but a lot of people forget that he was also a committed socialist. Now, in the British Empire at that time, you had what were called Fabian socialists, who were people that were against Marxism and wanted a gradual transition into socialism, but they still wanted to keep the British Empire. H.G. Wells was a self-described democratic socialist, or kind of like a Bernie Sanders of science fiction. And one of the things I remember that was interesting about H.G. Wells, he has a book that he writes about observing, I guess, Du Bois and Booker T. Washington early in the 20th century. And Wells actually thought Booker T. Washington was the greater thinker. And which I believe, in my opinion, I think history has borne out that Du Bois was the more forward thinker than Booker T. Washington. Du Bois at the time was also interested in, for a period of time, was a committed socialist also. But one of the things he writes about, having been a part of the socialist movement, he thought because of racism that Black Americans or people in the diaspora would never gain the agency, autonomy, and political freedom that they deserve within the context of Western socialism. Next slide, please. So by the time Du Bois, where you see this kind of summed up, he had written the book Souls of Black Folk 15 years earlier in the 20th century. But in Dark Water, and as Sheree Renee Thomas brings out in Dark Matter, he comes up with a short speculative story called The Comet. There's an interesting story around and history around Dark Water. Dark Water is written during the Spanish flu pandemic, where he's sitting up in this house writing all of this, and it comes out in 1920. And in that chapter, there's a chapter in there, it's called The Souls of White Folk, where Du Bois, who was much more of an idealist a liberal idealist early in the 20th century, recognizes in the wake of World War I, the Red Summer of 1919, where the lynchings were a lot of towns like, which culminates in 1920 with the Tulsa Massacre, Rosewood, and other massacres. He writes a chapter in there called The Souls of White Folk, talking about how for the white American, the Black is like their fixed star that they judge their social position by. Or you could say, as Chris Rock pointed out one time, some years ago, even a poor white has it better than a Black millionaire, because he could always say, at least I'm not a nigger. And we see that kind of behavior in the current Tea Party movement, where with the election of Obama, that has a certain effect on aspects of the larger American community in terms of how they see themselves with respect to the broader society. Because as other wealthier people have pointed out to me, that and has been recorded by people that write better than I do, that in particular, poor whites have long hated middle class or well-to-do African Americans. And a lot of times, as a recent politician told me over breakfast once, that they understand completely how poor whites are sometimes manipulated against their own interest from engaging in progressive activities with other people of color, where the whole society would benefit from those projects. Now, the short story, The Comet, deals with the idea in the face of catastrophe, where sometimes we'll forget about these aspects of racism in relation to public policy. And it deals with a story of a Black man named Jim and a white woman who survived this disaster that takes place in a metropolitan area, and they believe that they're the only two human beings left alive. And however, towards the end of the story, when they find out they're not the only two human beings left alive, and the crisis has passed, each retreats back into those social paradigms that have been prescribed by racist public policy. The second one, please. The next one. Later on, gospel choirs, Derek Bell, the lawyer Derek Bell, who was one of the founders of what legal scholars would call critical race theory in the 70s, which deals with a critique of social structures that lead to structural racism and other outcomes. And a lot of Derek Bell's work, and even in a speculative sense, comes to mind when I think of the outcome that just happened with the recent impeachment trial and white privilege surrounding Donald Trump and the inability of getting this man, who was obviously underqualified to be the president of the United States, but his privilege is going to allow him for the moment to escape the punishment for, even though people know that his words caused several people to be killed or murdered. The short story and Black speculative story that's in Gospel Choirs, which is called Space Traitors. Space Traitors talks about, even if some aliens, it talks about when some aliens come to this planet and America, that the aliens offer the American public saying, we will fix all your rivers, we'll fix your environment, clean up all your pollution, get rid of all your national debt, giving you gold, everything you want. And the only thing we want in exchange is everybody who is a descendant of the enslaved Africans in your society, which of course was a shocking thought. But Derek Bell uses critical race theory to point out how, because of the way the Constitution is written, that the Constitution could be amended so that they could have, the American public could vote on whether that aliens could take the descendants of enslaved Africans away on a spaceship. And he demonstrates how the Constitution leaves that open using this Black speculative tradition. Next slide, please. Now, moving up to the current moment, what we're calling Afrofuturism 2.0 and the Black speculative arts movement. As Nisi mentioned earlier, earlier, Mark kind of coined a term that of the Black speculative tradition that had been in existence in this country for at least since the middle of the 19th century. And that's not counting the cosmology and the practice that and related to hoodoo traditions and other things and traditions, oral traditions that were not written down at the time. And 2.0, that term emerges out of a conversation that I had with Alondra Nelson at an event we had at Emory University several years ago, talking about the need to revise that term that Mark had kind of defined in that moment with the interview, talking about this is now a planetary phenomenon, as the African diaspora is a part of the African Union now as the sixth zone. And talking about this includes elements of philosophy, applied science, community programmatics, and aesthetics, to then begin the talk of establishing a philosophical, political, socio-political framework for this tradition, which is in that tradition, as I mentioned earlier, of the kind of work that people like Du Bois, and then as H.G. Wells and the Fabian socialists did in relation to sci-fi and the European tradition. In the 2.0 volume, one of our contributors, Esther Jones, she writes a brilliant short chapter that she later puts in the book that deals with African-American women's health in this speculative tradition, talking about the relationship between the works of people like Octavia Butler and Black women's health in terms of Black women's bodies, by pulling in Octavia's work to critique these health outcomes that she recently published as a solo book. And then when we followed up the second half of the anthology, the Black Speculative Art Movement that Sheree Renee Thomas was kind enough to write the foreword to it, we were basically kind of bracketing these ideas and enlarging upon them in these areas of not just science fiction, but music, philosophy, applied science, digital humanities, sexual orientation. What does this mean in terms of Black futurity, art, and design? And so when we did a presentation and a talk about this in South Africa, one of the scholars down there, Bongani Mandando, he looked at what we were doing with Afrofuturism 2.0 and the Black Speculative Art Movement was the 21st century version of what Alan Locke did with the his famous work that he comes out in the 20s. Alain Locke, I don't know why that escapes me right now. Maybe someone will remind me. Sheree might chirp in. Where the new Negro, where these two books represent the works and thinking of people who have no memory of the civil rights movement or segregation. And so now the speculative work that's being produced by this generation in this century is not necessarily affected so much by some of the outcomes or the desires, or is not restricted to the boundaries of the nation state in terms of how we see our future. As the nation state is an artificial construct that is produced as a result of the Westphalian political tradition and was imposed on people of color around the world, such as the Berlin Conference in Africa and other countries. And so now we're starting to move because with the technology in terms of blockchain technology, the idea of possibly creating a virtual African civilization that exists in our imagination and in technology and in cyberspace before it begins to influence public policy to create an actual African civilization that exists from its diaspora to the continent. And so when you got that kind of imagination, and with what this kind of stuff Nisi Shawl writes about, if you can remember that we were here before there was a United States, therefore our imagination can then begin to imagine after a United States is no more, where might we be? Because in the Black speculative tradition, it helps people of African descent locate themselves in the past, the present, the contested present, and impossible futures in terms of where technology is going. And so a lot of people now are from the movement now are looking at how these ideas can be adapted into grants. What are some of the political outcomes as now people are talking about a Pan-African currency? What does this mean in terms of how we're going to feed ourselves? What does this mean in terms of genetics? One of the things we've talked about and we discussed is as one of these knucklehead scholars the other day talked about using CRISPRs and gene editing to close the IQ gap between Black people and white people in terms of how technology can be misused. And this goes back to the eugenics debates that the socialists kind of usher in the 1920s that Harriet Washington talks about in her book, Medical Apartheid. So the question then becomes, with all the new technology that's arising now, are we going to enter into a new era of medical apartheid based upon these class distinctions that we have now between the 1% and the rest of us in relation to human augmentation? Hey, if you're wealthy, you can live to be 150, but if you're poor, maybe your life expectancy will be 65. And so that's what you're seeing now in a lot of the great in the Black speculative tradition, what's coming out now that has been addressed by other writers, looking at alternative histories. And then look, what does this look like in relation to public policy? And I'll be excited to just listen to what kind of questions that you all may have. And in the interest of time, I'll stop right there. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Reynaldo. And let's just give all of our panelists just a hand for these fantastic presentations. I'm excited to the conversation that I know you guys are going to have amongst yourselves, but also have with us as an audience. So please do feel free to, I have some questions from the chat that I can begin with, but of course, feel free to put questions in the chat or also hit the, use the raised hand function and you can ask your question, you know, in real time if you like as well. So there, we did have a couple, genre kind of came up a couple of times. All right, so I definitely would ask you all to sort of, do these, does genre, what does it do for you? What does it not do? Is it too limiting? You know, even genre terminology, you know, Renee or Sheree, you also, you know, African futurism versus Afrofuturism, right? Terminology, genre, I think those could be some interesting questions for us to consider. I think I would also, I'm just gonna kind of throw a list of things and then I'll sort of maybe ask us to maybe give us a place to begin. I think issues of the difference between sort of folk versus the scientific, right? Black bodies as technology, relationship to technology, Pan-Africanism, the relationship between the sort of imaginative and our actual futures, right? What we imagine in speculative fiction versus its political consequences. Just a lot of very fruitful things for us to discuss, I think. I'm excited. Clearly, I need to stop geeking out and just sort of get to something. So, but maybe we'll begin with this question of genre, right? It sounds like, we often think of science fiction as a thing, right? Or at least from this, maybe, publishers and marketers sort of put things in sort of categories. But I think in a variety of ways, you all are talking about either in your own work or in the work of others that it's not so easy to necessarily label the work that is being done as just solely this. So I'll just leave it there. What do you guys think? How do you sort of think about these issues of genre and these like labels of science fiction versus fantasy versus the ethno-Gothic, horror, right? All these sort of things that we see these Black writers now doing, or you all are doing as well.
Well, I'll just say that coming from a publishing side, those terms are real estate terms that we use to try to guide our readers to particular bodies of work. They don't always work comfortably for all of the work, and some of the titles, of course, can exist comfortably in multiple different parts of the bookstore. And so different writers will have different feelings about where they would like to be placed. Some writers are very particular. They want, they want Black readers to be able to find the work. And so they don't mind being in a place that indicates that this is like Black literature or what have you. Others want to have, feel like they want to be a part of the largest audience. And not that only Black readers are buying Black work, but they want to be, I'm not a Black writer, I am a writer, so they want to be in the larger community or what have you. So there's different conversations about that. I don't really get into those things, but just on a practical matter, speculative fiction is an umbrella term that I used based on how Samuel Delaney used it. He and Marilyn Hacker used it when they did their anthology, and it's coming from where it was coined from Robert Heinlein, who used speculative fiction as a way to talk about how not only technology and science might change over time, but how societies might change the way they're organized and the different values that they have over time. So that's how speculative fiction was used then, but it became a larger umbrella. I understand that it was controversial because there is also a part of the community that doesn't want to have their work, even though it's very classically science fiction or fantasy or horror. They want it to be called literary work, right? So they shy away from those conversations. I remember being in a reading that Margaret Atwood did at Columbia, and she was actively being heckled by I don't know, I can't really call them fans, I don't know, but I feel like you are a fan if you took a train to Columbia, uptown, Upper West Side, to go and stand in line, this long, huge line to go see a writer, then you are a fan as well. But I don't think she welcomed the conversation. She kind of moved through it, but they're like, you're writing science fiction, just say it, stop playing, that kind of thing, right? So that happens, but it's a real estate term just for practical terms. But speculative fiction is science fiction, fantasy, horror, and all the work that's interstitial or slipstream works or whatever is the fabulous work that kind of doesn't fit comfortably in the big pools, the big buckets. Science fiction are stories that where the science is so important to the storytelling that if you took the science element out, you wouldn't have a story, right? So that's a easy way to think of it. Fantasy are works where there is a whole other system of rules and magic and logic that is relevant to that particular world, not necessarily, going by the laws of physics or what have you. And where you can have all kinds of, you can have alternate other worlds or earthbound or space or what have you, but it's a magic that's involved. And the science isn't so important to that storytelling, which is why Octavia E. Butler considered Kindred probably one of her most well-known books and probably the most taught in her career, why she considered it a fantasy versus a science fiction novel, because she didn't spend time with her readers explaining the mechanism for Dana being pulled back to her ancestral plantation in Baltimore, Maryland. So
I would just add that people love to classify things. It's like, it's part of our brains. I think we love to come up with categories for things. And we also, as writers, we like to mess with those categories. So, people will do the thing of stepping back from a category, but they will also say, okay, I'm writing about, African juju, but I'm also writing about aliens landing here from space. So, you call it what you want, but just give me the money and I'll keep writing it.
Yeah. I saw a comment in there that talked about why I mentioned African futurism. Well, I'm mentioning African futurism because this is a term that Nnedi Okorafor has coined for herself, and I will say for herself, and other people will gather around it or not. I know when she first introduced it, it wasn't received very well at the festival, where because they're like, okay, that's cool for you. We're doing Afrofuturism, So things take time. There are people who don't particularly care for Afrofuturism. I would just say for 20 years, Nnedi was writing and publishing as an Afrofuturist, whether she liked it or not. She didn't turn down any reading engagements. She didn't turn out any checks. She didn't stop doing interviews. She was on billboards. That's the work that she was doing. So it's going to take a while before the mainstream, who is now really, many people are just now discovering her work from the screen adaptations that she is doing, that we are waiting to see those films. So they think of her as an Afrofuturist because she lived her whole career doing that. She's in, Dark Matter, what have you, and I think both of the volumes, and never turned down anything that I'm aware of in the Afrofuturism community. But that doesn't mean just because someone labels you as something that you feel comfortable with it, because there are other writers who are labeled by stuff and they're still like, thinking about it, or they don't want any label at all. So I think it's perfectly valid and wonderful for people to claim themselves, just as long as you're respectful about how you do it, especially if you've been in that field for 2 decades. So African futurism, as she defines it, she has written about it on her blog. I believe she has written about it in another volume that came out recently. And so it's going to take time for people to begin to think of her in this other thing that she created just now. So, just to put that out there, that's my thoughts on that. But I would like to mention it because if you want to separate the work and say African futurism is another thing, then that is perfectly fine, as long as you are very clear that it's what that means, and know that readers are going to do what they want to with these categories.
That's for sure.
They're going to do what they want to. So, but for me, Afrofuturism, African futurism, I mean, African writers that I know spent so much time running away from genre, that I could name the people who actively claimed the genre on my one hand. So it's kind of disingenuous to pretend as if it's this huge, long history of it, because it isn't. And in fact, when you could have been doing that, you weren't. You were trying to get the Kane Prize or the Heinemann Prize or the Booker Prize. And you knew at that time you wouldn't get it writing science fiction. It's a new day from when Mark Derry had his conversation with Samuel Delaney and with Trisha Rose and Greg Tate. And so this work has become more mainstream. And so you can have Old Drift, when, the Arthur Miller, excuse me, Arthur Miller, but Arthur C. Clarke Prize. Now, that probably wouldn't have happened 20 years ago or 15 years ago, what have you. So it's a lot of changes now. And when things seem more comfortable and more open, then yes, people are going to rush through the door. But the door was opened by Black American Afrofuturists. And I will never stop saying that, because that is the actual history. That is the actual lineage, all the way from 1857. And if you want to be extra, you could argue a little bit for Phyllis Whitney. If you want to imagine a space of which you don't exist in, to imagine a freedom that you don't have. As Andrea Hairston has said, Harriet Tubman had to imagine something that didn't exist before so that she can make it happen. Stacey Abrams had to imagine something that didn't happen, her and the other women activists, to make it happen. It took over a decade to do so.
I was going to say Walida and Marisha and what's her name?
Adrienne Marie Brown.
Adrienne Marie Brown. They talk about the fact that we are walking science fiction because we are the dreams of freedom that our ancestors had.
Yes, absolutely.
Love that. I love that. I love that. We've always been Afrofuturistic, right?
Not by choice, just by necessity.
Not by choice, by necessity. Yeah, right.
By necessity, that history. Yeah.
All right. I have another question. This is from Melissa, or I have a question from Melissa Noel. How can we connect science to the human genome and Afrofuturism? So this is kind of a multi-part question. So I guess thinking about, Afrofuturism, connecting to the human genome and all that sort of stuff around that. Also, how can fiction write about a place where Black progress is not saturated in what white people think, do, or act? And then this is a multi-part question. Well, we'll start with those two. Maybe we'll get to the other one. So thoughts about the relationship between science, the human genome, and Afrofuturism, and thinking about Black progress, how to write about Black progress in a way that's not saturated in what white people think, do, and act.
Well, I would take the second part first, because that I feel like I have a little more focus on that. I mean, you move away, you go to a different place, you go to what's that planet that Nalo Hopkinson wrote about in Midnight Robber, Toussaint, a place that's settled by Black Caribbean people, so there you go. Or my story, Good Boy, I have these people, they call themselves Neo-Negroes, and they have set up a colony on an extrasolar planet. So yeah, you go somewhere else.
I don't know. I would think about it like this. My thing is, when I hear that question, how do you do it? I'm like saying you just got to if someone's stronger than you, you go into the weight room and you lift more weights and you get stronger. One of the things that I remember when I was in a particular jungle setting in Southeast Asia back during the Cold War in the 80s, and I remember during that cruise, how these people with weapons just walked up on us out of the foliage, and they had their weapons weren't good as ours. And I remember telling a friend of mine, the only thing that keeps them from kicking our butt now is because we have better technology. Mm-hmm. Take away the technology, we might lose. And so my thing is, if you have to look at that question related to whiteness and freedom, whatever, based upon the last 500 years, the only time European people expect non-European people is when European people see that your weapons are just as good as theirs, which is why I look at what happened with, that's why Mao Zedong, when he forges the modern Chinese nation state and had to get them from stop doing the old Confucianism thing and thinking that martial arts and the better philosophy was, he said, no, power grows out of the barrel of a gun. So in the 21st century, I guess they say power grows out of the barrel of a ray gun. And so basically, in this race to the bottom that capitalism and the 1% is forcing here in the 21st century, because I tend to be, as an observer, I've seen how human beings are when there's only food left for 50 people and you got 100 people. The strong are going to take advantage of the weak, and the weak will take advantage of the sickly. And I mean, COVID-19 and the way these shots are distributed now, they said the other day, even though they've shown that Black and brown people are not getting them the shots because of this structural racism, other people are still getting them before them. When I was in the military, they could order the military physician to line up with trucks with these shots and get them to the population or whatever. So I'm at the point that I just really don't give a damn about the idealistic pie in the sky utopian sci-fi anymore. People are actually showing you what they believe in by what they do. Okay, so as when I had to meet with a member who was a person of a local African government who asked me about their military, I said, look, one Marine battalion could kick the doors into your city just like that, because this doesn't even look as good as the New York City police force. So you need to think about how to protect your citizens. The problem with Nigeria now in the Boko Haram situation is that the army is too small over there because they didn't spend enough resources to train enough of their people how to speak to each other. 100,000 men is not enough men to guard a country of 150 million people. And because of kleptocracy, their oil is about to go down worse because now the rest of the world is moving around away from carbon-based fuels. So Nigeria is not going to have a good future in the near future as the oil revenue drops in value. Now that's just a plain, it's all at us right now. And so we're probably in parts of the world, we're going to enter the era of the warlords in terms of, or more like city states where life for rural people is going to suck. And people that live in the city state that got the technology and the ability to get it there are going to basically have better lives. You know, isn't that why the people in these red areas in America are mad now? People in the cities, we have most of the money, we have most of the wealth, most of the technology. And people in these rural areas are getting tore up by opioids. The infrastructure is breaking down. They're aging. I believe there's even here in the Midwest, there's a county out in Kansas that's trying to, I believe that was online, trying to auction off property related to the school system because they don't have enough young people to keep the school system open. So we're living science fiction right now. It's no longer we can forecast it. It's happening. I mean, in terms of the plagues. The economy is changing, platform capitalism. Now Bitcoin is at 47,000 a coin because people's confidence in the dollar is waning. And so I've never seen a civilization, and someone else can help me. The plague was enough to bring down and weaken the Roman Empire. I've never seen civilization survive a plague. Your economics is bad and the technology is changing and your demographic shifts, the same way those big migrations of barbarians caved in the Western Roman Empire. So I've never seen it before. Maybe it's happened, but I don't believe in magical thinking. I'm just saying, based upon human behavior over the next 30 years, oh, and I left out climate change, you know, so the near future is not so happy, you know, and they're going to be winners and losers based upon the existing data that's out there. All the trend lines are going in the wrong direction right now. And so therefore you have to start looking at what are some of these dystopian outcomes going to be, because we narrowly missed these people overthrowing the government on January 6th, trying to reinscribe the handmaiden's tale for the United States of America. And that was a close call that just happened January 6th. And so, and that 75 million people are not done. You know, they're going to want to come back for another round next year, as we're in the midst of an uncivil war at the moment. And that's why I think a lot of too many people are burying their heads in the sand, because we can't run away from this right now. I mean, their history has shown there are populations that did not want to believe that their government was really going to try to oppress them, until it was too late, and they just couldn't even believe it while it was happening to them at the time. And there's going to be some unpleasantries, I believe, here in the next 2 to 3 years that people just got to get ready for.
Okay, I'm seeing some questions. I wanted to just quickly, just in case we don't get at them in here from 2 o'clock, 2:03, 2:04. Some of them are kind of random, but I'm still going to try to address them because what is this? We're all writers here, writing science fiction. So do I want to speak about the Dogon people and their relationship to Mali and astronomy? Well, there's a scholar who's a cultural astronomer, Jarita Holbrook, who's written books, and that's her expertise. So that's where you want to go from that. On the human genome and Afrofuturism, it's another element of the human body, another element of science. People who want to write about that will, how we connect it the same way we do any technology in Afrofuturism. And if you want to think about more about maybe Black bodies and Black people's relationship to science, you can just look to eugenics. You can look to Harriet Washington's book, Medical Apartheid. And I know there are poets who've written whole volumes based on that book alone. I'm sure it has impacted someone's science fiction somewhere. How can we write fiction? Write fiction about a place whereby Black progress is not saturated with what white people think? That's called post-colonialism. And Nalo Hopkinson and Upinder Mihan co-edited an anthology called So Long Been Dreaming, Post-Colonial Science Fiction and Fantasy. I have a story in there. There are others. It's very difficult if you're talking about Black progress, because you can't have Black progress without dealing with white oppression and white supremacy and the global economy, which is exploitative and based on taking natural resources from other nations and making sure that they can't develop them, and also devaluing those natural resources so they don't even get the profit from it. So just look to Africa, look the entire continent of Africa, and look to India and other places of South America, and there you'll have your answer for that. So there is possible, and there are people who write whole stories. I know that Toni Morrison made that part of her project, that she didn't want to have a white gaze as the center of her storytelling about us. But if we're talking about Black progress, it's going to be a part of it. It's going to, but it doesn't have to be the heart. And there's writers like Zigzag Claiborne or Clarence Young and LaShawn Wynack and others, and Andrea Hairston, who can write hopeful science fiction and fantasy that gives a hard look at the things, but shows ways communities are doing other stuff, and it's not the center of the storytelling. So there's a lot of good work there. Daughters of the Dust is a historical work. It is not Afrofuturism, but in terms of looking at this movement of the Geechee Gullah people, moving to Nova Scotia, it incorporates the idea of Haile Gerima's Sankofa, which is not his. He did a film though called Sankofa. It's a West African Ghanaian concept. So where you see the Adinkra symbols, that's where that comes from. And it's the idea of looking at your past to understand your present so you can build a better future. So that's just part of what we do as science fiction writers, Black science fiction writers, where that the past does inform us, but all of us are commenting on the present. So.
And an interesting thing of what to do was, and this is the kind of the humorous thing, both of my parents are in their 80s right now. And that's why this whole era has been kind of terrifying for me in terms of the COVID era, how my brothers and I, got my mother moved out of Mississippi to Seattle, and then my mom called me a couple months ago. She said, thank God you all had the sense enough to move me out of Mississippi, because Seattle has a better infrastructure in terms of healthcare out there in Seattle. And my father's in a home now for veterans out there. And that's why when we're talking about now the way this system works, like I believe on the West Coast, people are making decisions now who deserves to be resuscitated and who doesn't, you know, because we're not prepared to take care of everybody. And I'm like, you know, I'm like, dang, my father served in a war or whatever. And so the thing is, there's nobody should be disposable, but they're out there making decisions on who should be revived and who should just be left at home to pass away in certain situations, as though if you're older or whatever, you're somehow unworthy of being saved. Where in every other culture, the elders are the repository of wisdom, you know. But we're over here talking about throwing away generations of wisdom simply because we might not have enough vaccine supplies. And we're just treating this like this normal, you know, to decide who lives and dies rather than holding accountable the people who made the political decisions not to produce enough of whatever we need to survive. That's why a lot of my speculative writers for Berlin, they told me, man, I don't want to visit you all over there. You all are almost like the Hunger Games now in terms of how you're dealing with how people get assistance and medical treatment and fighting over how much people should eat or whatever just to get through it.
It's always been the Hunger Games. That's the thing.
But see, what the COVID did is it exposed it. It kind of pulled the curtain back and let them know, yeah, it's always been that way. And so, you know, they, you know, at the later stages of the empire, where, you know, they've run out of bread and games to keep us entertained. You know, as we wait for the next Netflix show that we can binge for a week or whatever, you know, to keep us occupied from watching what they're doing in terms of public policy. You know, the UAE just sends a ship to Mars. Okay, that's an Arab country in the Gulf region. And that's why I can't stress enough how America, but we're not educated. The world is not waiting for us to get our act together. Now, everyone, I see plenty of people on this screen. 30 years ago, you did not imagine China or India or an Arab nation sending a rocket to Mars, you know, because we thought only the Soviet Union or America could do that. Well, a lot of other countries can do that now, because one of the lessons I also learned in the last 30 years, as I was an undergraduate in the 90s reading some of this stuff, was every country, I believe the Danish, they told us openly, said, oh yeah, since you all are our army, we spend all our money on educating our people and building up our infrastructure in Copenhagen or whatever. And so while we spending stuff on the Pentagon, which, yeah, we got some great stuff. We can blow up the world 55 times. All these other nations invested on science and education and technology, which is why Korea has better high-speed internet than we have. And I remember being over there when they were preparing for the Seoul Olympics, and they were still trying to get their public health system together. So a lot of the countries, they've just used their time more wisely the last 30 years than we have. You know, we're over here arguing, I mean, what is there climate change or real science debates that I thought were solved by the 70s. And now we have people questioning science. We have them questioning basic things that were taken for granted by the 1980s. And we're having, you know, and that's why it's I like using Sheree's word. It's just bizarre to me that we're having to revisit some of these discussions about science and survival now. And please, don't any of your friends take the vaccine. I took 15 shots being in the jungle, whether it was for yellow fever, all kinds of stuff, where I went all over the world. I didn't develop two heads or a tail and some wings or whatever, you know, so the vaccine is probably pretty good.
I mean, since we've been talking about the pandemic, we have the chat is blowing up. So clearly you all are really sparking the minds and the imaginations of our audience. But since we're on the pandemic right now, and then Reynaldo, you mentioned Du Bois writing the Comet during, you know, the Spanish flu pandemic. I'm curious, you know, so this is maybe, you know, maybe I'm just being nosy, trying to get, you know, how are sort of Afrofuturist writing, how are Black science writers really thinking at this particular moment, right?
Well,
Are people like, is this like actually, like, is the pandemic changing?
Yeah, I'm actually writing about it because I'm writing a sequel to Everfair. Everfair ends with people in the in Africa and Asia and all of these like non-European countries being basically inoculated with a different form of the pandemic that the last pandemic we had, the influenza pandemic. So so now, you know, what has happened in the part I'm writing now, the novel I'm writing now is called Kinning. Europe has been decimated. The flu there was far worse. And people are all talking about, like, you know, you don't want to be near any Europeans, you know, they call it the German flu. The whole cities, whole governments have been wiped out. And it certainly changes the politics of this alternate history where, like, oh, everybody in China and in all these African countries, they're like way technologically advanced, and they're keeping going forward because they were fine in the midst of a pandemic.
And to co-sign what Nisi just said, because I love how she writes alternative histories, people keep forgetting the Spanish flu wasn't the first time this happened. African Americans in the North, in Philadelphia in 1793, purchased a lot of their first property because they were the frontline workers in 1793 in the yellow fever outbreak, because Philadelphia was the nation's capital at the time. Philadelphia is the beginning of Black civil society in the United States, because that's where you have the founding of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and of course up north with the Prince Hall Masonic Order. So that's why a lot of the younger Afrofuturism, I'm like, look, to me, when I was studying rhetoric, a lot of times I would tell people that are engaged in speculative fiction, you ought to be a good student of history too. Because a lot of people that are out here writing, or they're saying they're calling themselves the new, the too many young writers, as Sheree talked about the real estate thing, they're not even doing the real estate good. They're just trying to brand themselves in a way instead of doing the actual homework of how does your idea connect to other ideas? Have people thought about this kind of thing before, you know, in terms of their own societies, other plagues, other scientific advancements. And I always tell some of my people that get too Afrocentric, it's okay to study European history. You know, they have some interesting history too, because a lot of what they did with European history, they tried to come and impose it on the new country here, bring a lot of their biases here because they couldn't make it over in Europe. So they try and it wasn't until I went into a Masonic lodge in Germany a few years ago as a member of the Masonic Order, when I'm probably the first African American they ever had in there. And this is over where I found the story about why they not let Wagner become a member of the Masonic Order over in Bavaria, because he was considered too much of a whoremonger. But when I was exposed to some other things I saw, when I saw it, then I understood the movie The Skulls really well, in terms of where some of these writers and people get their ideas from. And you get exposed to some of the alchemists and the other speculative thinkers of the European era, whether it's John Dee or Agrippa or Paracelsus, in terms of how this then ties and influences what they would call the not hermeneutics, it's called starts with an H. I can't think. Mine is slipping at the moment. Hermeticism. And in terms of how this all circulates around Mediterranean civilization did by the Arab trade from North Africa. And so what is actually happening now, you have a bifurcation where the Black speculative tradition can trace its stuff back to the Congo region of West Africa, where 90% of us come from. And archaeologists, anthropologists can then trace it back up to the Nile Basin, in terms of where a lot of these ideas come from, that go down and up and down the Nile, make its way over to West and Central Africa, in terms of the cosmology and cosmogony of the Dogon people. And so there's that lineage there. And the other bifurcation is where the derivatives of what's the leftover of the Roman Empire, Italy and all, from because of the Arab and the Moorish Empire at the time, they get exposed to Hermeticism, which comes out of the same region, and then they transfigure it towards their needs in terms of what they would later call alchemy and alchemist, which is a word, an Arab derivative word, to kind of recreate
All
them.
the
Yeah,
math.
they can reinvent themselves. Okay.
Algorithm.
So all of the stuff is already there, if people just go and do the homework.
One of the great things about traveling is you see things from another point of view because you're right there with it. And I had a chance to travel to the UAE at the time when the city that I was in was the current home of Islamic culture, and it's a title that gets passed around the world regularly. So they were hosting all of these visual arts exhibitions, and all the museums and things had exhibits that was fantastic. And that's when I looked and saw, the astrolobes and the other things, and saw the origin of much of our hard math is right there in the Middle East or what have you. And I'm a student of history, that's what I studied. I majored in history and anthropology, took one English class, because I just wanted to hear other stories, read other stories, and learn research skills, how a historian deals with primary sources and everything. But when I went over there, I realized, so not only did Western civilization bury the roots of where our philosophers, Aristotle and Socrates and the others, people actually studied and were students of the philosophy, and then were actually persecuted for it, imprisoned or murdered because of these thoughts, right? That history gets buried, and suddenly, it's built like on Phoenicians and the Greek, who did not have this philosophy, by the way. And then it gets rediscussed and kind of written as origin coming from there, when the roots are actually somewhere else completely. So but you find it out when you are actually doing that research. Then you find the primary sources, and they will tell you, Aristotle and others will tell you where they studied and where they got these ideas. So it's not even that much of a mystery. It's just like, as Reynaldo was saying, the mythology, the narratives that we tell each other, in order to build our own nation. Is a different thing. It's just an amazing thing. I want to go back to the pandemic because I'm literally a block away from a historic marker here in Memphis, Tennessee, that talks about the 1866 massacre that happened during the yellow fever epidemic, also 1 year after the Civil War. Mind you, Memphis had been occupied by Grant and the Union Army, and we had a 90-minute battle. That was it on the river. I think a gunboat came, they shot one fire off, and they surrendered. That was it, because we know Vicksburg had been burned to the ground, and we knew that Atlanta had burned, and Memphis did not want to burn. So that was that. Freedmen schools were immediately built on Bill Street, where the home of the blues, and right there in President's Island. So, beginning of America's first public schools, right, are happening here for freedmen, men and women and children from ages. I was able to go into the Freedmen's Bank records and to see their exes when they couldn't write their names at first, and then them signing their deposits with their actual names because they've been in a freedmen's school here in Memphis and actually were being paid. The fact that they were being paid for their labor was part of the reason why the Memphis police was part of the huge lynch mobs that came and burned Memphians for 3 days in a row, unstopped by even the Union Army. So that history is there. So when we talk about, the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic, which, by the way, the African Americans in the city survived it at higher rates than the white people who owned them previously. We don't know why, but that was the case. But that was kind of laid waste when the massacre happened, right? So it's that resentment that they were surviving. They had survived most of that pandemic. They actually are the reason why Memphis exists today. Robert Church helped rebuild the city and bought its charter after we lost it because we had so many deaths. We didn't have enough citizens in Memphis to be called a city anymore. And there was a Black freedman who was able to bring the city back to life and bring people back when they had fled it. So that history of like us, what the pandemic did to us, how we survived it, how it changed the history here is very close to me. So living through the pandemic here in America, and I feel like I've already lived through one, and that was the HIV pandemic when I was coming of age in the 80s. It was heartbreaking. So I'm absolutely sure, I'm certain that lots of writers will be. I've already received so many pandemic stories from FNSF already. I got 2,400 stories in my first month, and quite a few of them were stories that were very closely written about the pandemic. But yeah, I think it's going to.
Tell them about Red Spring coming up.
Oh yeah. So I co-curated a visual and literary online exhibition that is co-sponsored by Bill T. Jones's New York Live Arts Festival, which was supposed to happen last year, live in New York. We were all excited. And then of course the coronavirus arrived, and so everything was canceled. And it's been very difficult for the dancers and choreographers in the theater community, of course. So Reynaldo had this great idea to take the festival part of it and make it an online exhibit. They did the first one over the summer, and I finished the second one last fall, December, for like around the Christmas holiday. And so you should be able to see Red Spring, which is actually looking at how Black artists have experienced the pandemic and the initial quarantine, and how that's impacted their art and their work. So, yeah.
And one thing I want to add, how history repeats itself. 3 years ago, if you look at it, it's up on YouTube so you can see it. I did a talk for Tohu magazine outside of Tel Aviv a couple years ago. And during my talk, we talked about zombie plagues and whatnot, and that was the first time when I went over and I actually saw the wall that separates the West Bank from the other. And I was like, what? And I told them during my talk, and I think it might have irritated a couple. I said, a zombie plague or a plague, this wall is not going to keep it out. And I'm looking at, they're giving access to people on one side of the wall are getting the vaccine. Then on the other side of the wall, they're not getting it. The wall is not going to keep a plague from infecting you over there, and when everybody should be getting the shot, and so that's why I'm like, man, human beings can just be so irrational in the face of science sometimes. And so, yeah, I'm seeing, and it was, the talk was centering around this idea of Arab futurism and Afrofuturism, where the Palestinians said I think they were talking about an artist they were getting so angry, this is going to build an underground city of Gaza just to get away from the Israelis. They're going to build their city and civilization underground just to get away from them. And so I follow up with them periodically, but when I saw the recent stuff the last several weeks about how they're giving vaccinations out on one side of the wall and then they're abandoning the people on the other side of the wall, makes no sense in terms of the long run moral and ethical implications of how, if I'm a young person at that time, there's not going to be no forgiveness in my heart. If I had to watch my parents die because they didn't have a vaccine, I'm not going to feel too friendly towards the people on the other side of the wall. So I mean, that's why it's kind of like the fabric of the kind of civilization that was constructed post World War II is unraveling, based upon these things that we said would never happen again around human rights or whatever, and it's happening.
I have to say that I recall Octavia Butler talking about the idea that you would deny illegal immigrants to California healthcare. She's like, oh, great, let's set up a little pool of communicable diseases, let's have this whole group of people that, this whole population where we can have sort of like this petri dish of infection. She was being sarcastic.
All right, I have a couple of questions, 2 questions I'm going to try to maybe bring in at once, and you can do with them as you like. One was a question from Christian Ivy, and the question was, how does Afrofuturism contend with social death S with the capitalist sign. So, I actually had a thought about this, the diversity between Afrofuturism and Afropessimism. I think, Nisi, you were talking about, so much of, for your work is Afrofuturism is about looking forward with hope, right? So that was something that resonated with me. And then the other question had to do with, I think all of you could talk about it, but it was around Sheree's phrase around, and it might've been a title of something she's working on, I've already forgotten, but ancient futures, right? The sort of juxtaposition or sort of thinking about the sort of, how can something both be an ancient and a future, right? But thinking about sort of time in general, right? There's a way in which, there's sort of, there's, I would say, these sort of, Western constructions of time as linear, right? And sort of sequential and like it's progressive, right? And there's ways in which it seems what the conversation that we're having or you all are having is asking us to sort of question that particular narrative around time. So I guess there's kind of two questions, jump in where you fit in. So this question around the relationship between Afrofuturism and social death / Afropessimism, and then this issue of time and temporality, ancient futures.
I remember responding to that, and it's in a talk I did over in Johannesburg, South Africa, in the fall of 2018, for the local paper. They're talking about this thing of Afrofuturism versus Afropessimism, and social death being the term that I believe Orlando Patterson is credited with, and some Sadia Hartman and some others are kind of on this Afro-pessimist perspective. And I believe, I can't think of the gentleman's name who came out with a book elaborating on the meta theory of it. To me, an Afro-pessimist, if that's a philosophical framework, if you actually believe in social death and you accept that as a category, and my issue with the Afro-pessimists, they never arrive at a solution of how to correct it, okay? In terms of, basically social death is, for those that don't know, that saying is, if you're in a society that has defined you as not being human, and that is your social status, how do you reconcile, how does Afrofuturism look at that? And the way I look at it is, an Afro-pessimist would probably accept being put at the bottom of the well and never getting out. Where an Afrofuturist, I'm gonna let Sheree and Nisi stand on my shoulders, so somebody's gonna get out of the well sooner or later. And the other thing is, how does ancient and future go along? That's where I look at this idea of non-binary thinking. That means having the ability to hold two contradictory thoughts together at the same time, like something like a libertarian socialism or whatever, where you still retain the individual perspective that you like, but the larger society is still taken care of. So I don't see ancient and future being contradictory. I mean, even in our own community, we talk about young people with old souls. What does that mean? So that's how I see, when I hear ancient future, oh, that person has an old soul, in terms of.
Yeah. I was going to say also, the book is 9 Bar Blues. It's my story collection, and it's stories from an ancient future. It's in its second printing. So thank you, all the great readers who helped make that happen. I'm really excited. And also when you think about language in our tenses, particularly the other Romance languages, there is no conflict in this idea of the past and the present and future. There are some tenses that incorporate that, that ideal that something could be happening now, or it could have just happened, or it could be on the way to happening. And it's, and it just depends on how you write it in the sentence that lets you know which tense it is. But there's the awareness that it can be any of these things, right? That we exist not just in one point of time, but we are connected, to these other points around us. And even from a spiritual perspective, you're looking at African traditional religions and how they have changed and evolved in different parts of the African diaspora. There is also an awareness that you are connected to the unborn, you are connected to the ancestors, and they are with you at all times. And even physically, each person born physically female, in terms of you're born with eggs, right? Those part of them, they come from your grandmother, right? You are carrying generations with you, whether you ever give birth or not, that potential is there. So it's not as contradictory a thought, especially if we're looking at the fact that the world that we're still negotiating in America in particular is the same types of conversations that my ancestor Fannie Lou Hamer in Ruleville, Mississippi, Sunflower County, Mississippi, where my paternal part of my family comes from. She's the same question she asked and was beaten for when she, testified in Congress, are the same questions that we're facing now, and you can just keep going back and back. So we're in the present. We hope for a better future, but we're still impacted by the past. We are still impacted by the choices and the systems, the institutions that were built up to replicate themselves no matter what individuals do. And that's another thing I don't think people are aware of. You have agency, but if you're a part of an institution or you are benefiting from an institution, it is designed to operate whether you actively engage with it or not. Unless you dismantle it and start something new, it will continue to operate as it was designed to do so. So I think about the fact that we were brought here without any citizenship for the most part, right? There was a brief period in Virginia where you could be an indentured servant, right? But the moment those indentured servants who had paid off their debt began to outcompete the people who they were originally indebted to, guess what? They changed the laws in Virginia. Guess what? We're watching that. We've just watched that happen. How, you have legal precedent and you have, the way things are normally were done. And then I've watched it since 2000, 2003. I mean, since the Supreme Court helped place George Bush into office. Everyone's upset about what happened recently, in our capital. It was very unfortunate, but I don't feel like this is the first time we've had these kinds of experiences. I think that I remember watching George Bush call his brother Jeb in Florida to try to get a different outcome in Florida. And I woke up thinking I had one president. I woke up the next day and I had another one, right? So the call that was made to Georgia is very, very familiar. We've been dancing down a very dark road for all of my lifetime that I'm aware of, and I'm only in my 40s. So yeah. Just want to say that old systems, we are connected to the past always, especially if we don't change those systems in the past. They become our present and they will shape the future.
I would
Nisi, we'll have to give you the final word on this issue because we're actually approaching time. So,
okay. So I want to recommend that people look for the work of Rasheeda Phillips, who is a woman who just blew my mind when I met her, by stating outright, time is a lie. She is an activist. She lives in Philadelphia. She's a science fiction author. She's a philosopher. And she just came right out and said, time is a lie. I'm like, what? No, I will be meeting you at 5:05. And, but she did back it up with the same sort of things that you're talking about, Sheree. Also, this is something that I've touched on in one of my stories, something more, in which someone comes back from the future to make sure that this will sound familiar, to make sure that their ancestors are able to reproduce, right? That's the same premise as behind fledgling, but the person that they're protecting thinks that they're from the past. Why? Because they're Black. Because the person that's being protected is white, and the person who's doing the protecting is Black, and therefore, oh yeah, you're obviously, a savage from the distant past, so we have to watch ourselves being relegated to a different, to the past, when we actually are part of the present and really hoping part of the future.
thank you so much. This was such a fantastically illuminating and thought-provoking and future oriented, even though I know we just heard time was a lie, but I feel like, I feel like, you know, that there really is a sort of exciting tomorrow and the work that is you all are representing. And so just thank you very much. I'm going to give you some actual hand claps. And we also have to give a thank you to New Hampshire Humanities, our sponsor, for graciously supporting this conversation and this program. So thank you again. And with that, I will turn it over to Latonya Wallace, who is one of our new board members at the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. We're happy to have her working with us. So Latonya.
Oh, thank you all. What a wonderful conversation we've had today. You know, each of you shared with us the magic behind your words. You know, you've opened up a dialogue that speaks to speculative fiction versus literacy work, science fiction versus fantasy, science and philosophy. Whatever audience, you know, you may try to reach, it's important to continue telling these stories and sharing these philosophies. And why? Because imagination and history, it runs wild in each of us, you know, at all levels. So it's important to simply embrace that. So thank you to Sheree, Nisi, and Reynaldo. The magic of your voices today was empowering and motivating. And thank you truly for sharing and providing, you know, literature and resources that we can reference as we educate ourselves and indulge in the stories being told from our past and our present. So thank you for leading this commentary about Afrofuturism and how important it is to explore culture and technology within our stories and share the feeling of hope with our future world. So again, as Dennis mentioned, the series is sponsored in part by New Hampshire Humanities. So thank you.
And 9-bar blues. I sent them what I wanted them to do. So thank you. Now more than ever, we need to pause intentionally. So please join us next Sunday, February 21st, from 2 to 4 p.m. for Race and Care of the Soul. So it is on to you, Jerian.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us. A special thanks to our panelists. This was a very engaging conversation. We're so glad you could join us. And the Black Heritage Trail will be here next Sunday from 2 to 4 with our next speakers, Thomas Moore, Reginald Wilburn, and Reverend Lauren Smith. Thank you so much. We hope to see you then.